Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. They say that every choice has consequences, but no one ever talks about how one reckless decision can ruin everything you thought was untouchable. My life came crashing down that night when I decided with my 50-year-old boss Vanessa. The office was lit up with the glow of the city, casting shadows across her office as she stood by the door, watching me. Earlier, she had said, "Let's finish this project tonight." Despite the futility of the task at hand, I persisted in staying late to attend to my boss Vanessa. This remarkable woman effortlessly held everyone's attention. Her long, dark hair cascaded in gentle waves over her shoulders, and her confident, fluid gait drew all eyes to her. Her magnetic presence was palpable, and her eyes had a way of penetrating your very being. As I sat at my desk, an unsettling sensation gripped me. Something was about to transpire with Vanessa. I turned to face her as she spoke, her voice soft but with an edge that made my skin prickle. Before I could process what was happening, she was even closer, her eyes locking onto mine in a way that made the room feel even more tense. Meanwhile, the sound of her heels echoed through the empty office, adding to the thick, palpable tension in the air. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't focus on the screen in front of me. Unexpectedly, her hand briefly touched my arm, sending a shockwave through me. I tried to tell myself to keep it professional, but I couldn't help but succumb. Then, without warning, she leaned in for a brief kiss, changing the dynamic irrevocably. I drew away in shock, but she didn't give me a chance to recover. Her intense, dark eyes watched my reaction, and I knew then that this wasn't just about work. It had never been. Vanessa had been showing her favoritism toward me for months, starting with little things like giving me extra time to meet deadlines and skipping meetings. However, it soon escalated. I'd always been a hard worker, but her praise went beyond my performance. It was obvious that she had her eye on me. Despite my best efforts to keep things professional, the tension between us became impossible to ignore. Eventually, she began asking me to stay late to work on projects that didn't truly require my attention. First, I believed it was because she trusted me, but then things started to escalate. As she kissed me, everything changed. I should have said no, I should have left, but instead I kissed her back. It was as if a floodgate had opened and all the tension we'd been dancing around for months spilled out in that one moment. But I knew it was her way of getting me alone. The signs were her overly long glances, subtle compliments that felt more personal than professional, and every time I told myself to stay focused on the work. I didn't manage to stop her, and I couldn't resist her either. Ever since that night, the weight of that decision looms over me in the office. I try to act as if nothing has changed, but Vanessa and I both know better. She keeps asking me to stay late, and I keep agreeing, knowing full well the consequences. Then there's my wife, who started asking questions, innocent at first, just wondering why I'm staying, but eventually becomes intrusive. I sense a growing sense of suspicion in her voice. She doesn't know it yet, but she's getting closer and closer to discovering the truth with each lie I tell her or excuse I make up. Vanessa doesn't seem to care. She knows she has control and she uses it. Whenever I consider ending the relationship or walking away, she reminds me of the promotion she promised, emphasizing how my career is flourishing thanks to her. I feel trapped, torn between retaining my job and keeping my. I tried to act normally the next day, thinking maybe we could just move past what happened and pretend it never happened, but the second I stepped into Vanessa's office, her gaze found mine and I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. By lunchtime, she had summoned me to her office and my marriage was crumbling. There's something about Vanessa that I find irresistible. Something about her confidence, her beauty, the way she knows exactly how to push my buttons. She's intoxicating. Just as I was about to apologize and try to make things right, Vanessa stood by her desk, arms crossed and an unreadable expression. Her voice was soft but firm, and her words hung in the air like a threat. She drew nearer, her pupils narrowing, and she said things like, "I've given you a lot of leeway, haven't I?" before moving on to discuss deadlines, prayers, and potential promotions. Everything she had given me was precariously predicated on her ability to make things difficult, and she made it plain that she knew how much I stood to lose if she did so. However, her tone changed as she smiled and her voice took on a more seductive quality. "You're good at what you do," she said, her warning echoing through the room. Rejecting her isn't an option if I want to keep my job or my future. With the promise of a promotion dangling in the air, I found myself entangled in her web. The weight of my job, my family, and my mind begged me to break free, but I felt trapped and there was no way out. So I reluctantly agreed. Little did I know that this decision would lead to something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Working late into the night became routine, but the work itself no longer mattered. Vanessa and I discovered ways to sneak into the building inconspicuously. We both knew it was reckless, but the intoxicating rush kept me hooked. Every time we were together, I felt like I was on the brink of disaster. The secrecy intensified everything, making every touch and stolen kiss electric. But as the affair progressed, the guilt weighed heavily on me. Whenever my wife smiled at me, it was like a weight was pressing down on my chest, and I hated myself for what I had become. At home, things began to fall apart. My wife noticed the changes, the late nights, the distant conversations. She was meticulous, and her suspicions were growing. Vanessa knew she had control, and she kept reminding me of the promotion, which was like a carrot dangling in front of me. The danger, though, was what hooked me. The prospect of being caught made every moment with her feel more exhilarating. She kept looking into my eyes as if to tell me something, but I always shrugged it off, explaining that we were working on a big project at work and that things would calm down soon. Nonetheless, the tension between us was obvious, and one night after yet another long day, Vanessa and I were alone in her office, completely absorbed in our work. Suddenly, the door creaked open and my heart skipped a beat. To my horror, it was my wife standing there, her eyes wide with shock. For a brief moment, I assumed that everything, my job, our marriage, our relationship, would come crashing down. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Everything came tumbling down, but Vanessa, as usual, drew back and pretended like nothing had happened. She smiled at my wife as if we were in the midst of a meeting, and I stumbled my way through an explanation about the late-night work we were finishing up. My wife's expression softened, but there was doubt in her eyes. She bought it barely, but I could tell that the near miss had weakened our carefully constructed lies. As my wife departed, I felt the guilt and fear of losing everything solid settle into my chest. On the surface, it appeared like everything was falling into place. My career was on the rise, and my wife was thrilled. Her pride was unmistakable as she told friends and family about my promotion. However, as I looked at Vanessa, a small knowing smile on her lips, I realized how deeply trapped I was. This wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a game, and I was dangerously close to losing. True to her word, Vanessa delivered the promotion. A bigger office, more responsibility, and, of course, a substantial salary. As much as I wanted to celebrate my promotion and feel proud of myself, the weight of the guilt that came with it was too much to bear. My wife thought of it as a reward for all my hard work over the years, but I knew it was the result of my affair with Vanessa, and Vanessa wasn't content to keep our relationship office-bound any longer. She began to insert herself whenever she wanted to. Her influence began to permeate all aspects of my life, going beyond her role as my boss. She began to call me more frequently outside of work hours, texted me late at night, and found excuses to stay in touch. My wife began to suspect something was amiss with each late-night text, and whenever the topic of our collaboration arose, she would say it in a light but suspicious tone. I ignored her, but I could tell she was beginning to make connections, like the promotion. It wasn't merely a promotion that entangled me in an unending web. A few weeks later, Vanessa planned a business trip. There appeared to be a few meetings in another city, but so far so professional. However, as the trip's details were ironed out, I became sick to my stomach. This wasn't merely a business trip. It was her chance to push the limits of our relationship. The meetings ended that night, and I went to my room to work while pretending to be professional. But then I heard a knock on the door and saw Vanessa standing there with a coy smile, asking if I needed anything. My wife's voice was dripping with suggestions, and the tension in the room was palpable. I answered the phone, my voice trembling, but I pretended to be normal, saying that I was just finishing up some work. With my heart racing, I danced delicately to keep my wife from overhearing anything suspicious during the seemingly endless call. Vanessa, leaning against the doorframe, listened intently and grinned, knowing full well how close I was to being caught. When the call finally ended, Vanessa sauntered over to the spot where I had been and whispered something in a low voice, amused by the danger. I managed to thwart her advances that night, barely maintaining our professional relationship, but it was another. After another near-death experience, it became clear that the affair was getting out of hand. I felt like I was balancing on a tightrope, with each passing day bringing me closer to the brink of disaster. The weight of the affair weighed me down, and the guilt gnawed at my sanity. I noticed that I was losing focus at work, even though I had fought so hard to maintain my promotion. Projects fell through the cracks and deadlines were missed, which was unlike me. At home, the constant pressure of living a double life was draining my energy. Things were getting worse. My wife could feel a change in me, and no matter how much I tried to hide it, she could tell. My smiles felt forced, my conversations were like walking through quicksand, and the strange excuses were piling up. I could see the hint of suspicion and doubt in her eyes as she approached the truth, and the increasing distance between us was the worst. I wanted out of this affair, which had once been exciting, but now felt like a trap from which I couldn't escape. Whenever I thought about ending it, Vanessa would. At the company's annual office party, which should have been a chance to relax and enjoy the company of coworkers and their spouses, Vanessa had me entangled in her web, and the thought of what might happen if I broke off our relationship kept me mired in self-doubt. The pressure was mounting from every direction, and my wife's suspicions made me feel trapped. Each interaction with Vanessa seemed to bring me one step closer to the ticking time bomb. Party began off well, with my wife mingling with the other spouses and me doing my best to remain by her side, trying to keep things normal. Then Vanessa arrived, looking as beautiful as ever. My heart sank the moment I laid eyes on her. I could feel her eyes on me from across the room, waiting for an opportunity when my wife wasn't looking. All night long, I worried about how I would keep things under control with Vanessa there. Whenever Vanessa wanted to get close to me, she would touch my arm or whisper a comment in a low voice, as if no one was looking. I felt like we were on the verge of disaster every time she spoke to me. I tried to act normal, but my wife could tell something wasn't right by the way I flinched whenever Vanessa got too near, and she would laugh nervously whenever we were near each other. While we exchanged looks, my wife's smile wavered multiple times, her eyes fixated on mine as if I could provide an explanation I couldn't. By the end of the night, I had barely prevented things from collapsing. However, my wife's silence on the way home conveyed a great deal. She didn't utter a word, but I could tell she was trying to put the pieces together. I knew it was only a matter of time until everything came tumbling down. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Vanessa made her most daring move yet. On a Friday afternoon after a meeting, she pulled me aside. I felt an overwhelming urge to say no, but her words lingered, enticing me with the promise of privacy and secrecy. I could confront her and finally end the affair on my terms, but I also knew the dangers that came with it. Her voice was low and enticing, and she leaned in closer, brushing her fingers lightly against my arm. My husband is out of town and will finally have the privacy that we deserve. It felt surreal walking into Vanessa's home that weekend. The house was quiet and elegant, but the promise of privacy was too good to pass up. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with the realization that this weekend could be the breaking point. There had been too many close calls, too many risks, and I was about to walk straight into the heart of it all, despite the mounting guilt and gnawing fear. With an air of unabashed wealth that only added to the danger, she smiled knowingly as she guided me through the roomy living room and into the bedroom. Her self-assurance and acting as if everything was fine should have been a warning sign, but I was too entangled to back out. Soon, we were hours into our affair, and the tension of secrecy had dissolved into the intense recklessness of the moment. For a brief moment, it felt like we were free, but that was just an illusion. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Shattered when we heard the front door open and her husband was home. Panic set in as Vanessa jumped out of bed, her eyes wide with terror. "He shouldn't be here," she hissed. She hurriedly gathered her clothes, but by the time we got them on, it was too late. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and there was no time to hide. Her husband walked in, his face almost too calm. He looked at me and then at Vanessa, his expression unreadable for a moment. The silence was deafening as the weight of. I was expecting an explosive scene, but what happened next took me entirely by surprise. His voice was strangely calm, and he looked directly at me with a steady gaze. "I've been having my fun too," he said, and the room went silent as the implications of his words hit home for Vanessa. Her face turned pale and she demanded, "What are you talking about?" In response, he laughed bitterly and said, "I've been seeing someone too. Unto mine, your wife, the world tipped, and in that instant, everything fell apart." The eerie quiet after her husband's revelation was crushing. Vanessa stared at him, her face pale with confusion as she tried to absorb his words. My wife and I felt my heart race, my mind race, and the ground shakes beneath me as I struggled to make sense of the impossible. At last, I spoke, my voice trembling, barely holding it together, while her husband's lips curled into. He spoke with a measured tone, almost too measured for the bombshell he had just dropped about your affair with Vanessa. Your wife and I, on the other hand, found solace in one another's company. The room fell into stunned silence once more, as we were all caught off guard. Vanessa stared at her husband, her mouth slightly agape. She hadn't anticipated this. The web of lies and deceit was unraveling at a rate none of us could have predicted. The weight of the irony crushed me as I felt sick from betrayal and discovered that my wife, whom I had thought I was protecting by keeping my affair a secret, had been cheating on me as well. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, a mixture of shock, guilt, and anger, and no one knew how to express themselves. The secrets of each person were exposed, and the silence was broken when Vanessa spat out, "You've been cheating on me." Vanessa's expression turned angry as she glared at her husband, her eyes betraying a combination of fury and disbelief. Her husband shrugged, his once composed demeanor now tinged with a hint of smugness. "Are you that surprised?" Vanessa snapped, her voice quivering with emotion. "You're no better than I am." The room swiftly descended into chaos as accusations were exchanged between them. They screamed at each other, their voices carrying through the house. I stood there, paralyzed by my guilt, my thoughts racing with the truth. My wife had been with him the whole time, and I had thought I was being clever by covering up my betrayal. I felt my fists clench, and the heat of betrayal in my chest grow hotter. I snatched my phone from the room and called my wife, demanding answers. My voice erupted in a low, barely controlled rage as I demanded, "Tell me the truth." After a long pause, she whispered a quiet, tearful confession, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened." Her words struck me like a punch to the gut. The affair, the lies, had been going on right under my nose the whole time, and I had been too preoccupied with my mess with Vanessa to notice. As the revelations about my wife's affair became clear, I felt numb and helpless. The tangle of lies had finally unraveled, leaving us all confused about what to do next. The fallout from this revelation was swift and brutal in the days that followed. Meanwhile, Vanessa and her husband continued to yell at each other in the next room. The reality of their phony marriage was starting to crumble before my eyes. The delicate web of secrets we had all woven came crashing down. My marriage, which I had taken for granted, was now in shambles. Our conversations were tinged with the bitter taste of betrayal. My wife had confessed her affair, and I still couldn't bring myself to do the same. On a darker note, we both knew that the truth was already there, unsaid but undeniable, between us. At work, things weren't much better, and Vanessa's inappropriate relationship with me couldn't remain hidden for long either. My reputation took a hit, and even though she tried to keep it under control, the damage was done. The promotion she had offered me was now just as unstable as everything else in my life. A career I had worked so hard for was suddenly hanging by a thread, and Vanessa's marriage over her husband ended quickly with a divorce filing. Now she is left trying to navigate the aftermath of her actions. Handle the aftermath of the professional disaster that ensued. The company refused to overlook her inappropriate conduct with me, and disciplinary action was imminent. Our affair, which had been hidden from view, was now in the open, and there was no turning back. The fallout swept through our lives, destroying everything in its path. I was left with the wreckage of everything I once valued. My wife and I spoke very little, and when we did, it was tense, filled with guilt, pain, and blame. I had broken the trust we had once had, and no amount of. I kept my job, but it felt hollow, like everything I had worked for was tainted by the choices I had made. Vanessa and I never spoke again, and her career suffered as a result. She became a cautionary tale of what happens when personal and professional lines blur. I didn't miss a beat, and apologies couldn't erase the damage the affair had done. The torture of work had become intolerable, and the promotion, which had been a sign of success, had become a curse. People looked at me differently, some with pity and others with judgment. I sat alone in the aftermath, overwhelmed by the weight of what we had done. It was a constant reminder of how things can quickly spiral out of control. As I thought about how my life had been ripped apart by a single decision, I couldn't help but reflect on how my marriage was in jeopardy, my career was in danger, and I couldn't help but wonder if forgiveness was even possible. The affair had ended, but the consequences were permanent. If my wife or I were to find out, the consequences of my actions would have been devastating. The question that plagued me the most, though, was not whether things would improve. Rather, it was whether I deserved them too. If you enjoyed this story of adultery and would like to see more like it, please subscribe to my channel and give me a thumbs up.